Which country lost the most people in World War II? Between 1939 and 1945, the world burned, and when the smoke finally cleared, over 70 million people were gone. But one nation's suffering was so vast, so incomprehensible, that even today we struggle to grasp its magnitude. This is the story of the deadliest war in human history, and the country that paid the highest price. World War II wasn't just a war, it was an eruption of humanity's darkest impulses, a conflict so total, so consuming, that it touched every corner of the globe, 60 countries, 100 million soldiers. But the real tragedy? Most of those who died weren't soldiers at all. They were mothers, fathers, children, people whose names we'll never know. And today we're going to talk about the nation that lost more of them than any other. This is their story. To understand the scale of what happened, we need to go back to the ashes of World War I. Germany, humiliated and economically destroyed, became a powder keg. The Soviet Union, born from revolution and blood, eyed the West with suspicion, and between them sat Poland, a reborn nation, barely 20 years old, sitting on the most dangerous piece of real estate in Europe, August 23, 1939. In Moscow, two mortal enemies signed a pact that would doom millions. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be erased. Again, a Polish woman who survived later recalled, "We thought we were safe. We thought the world had learned its lesson. We were wrong." September 1, 1939, 4:45 a.m. Without warning, without declaration, Hitler's war machine crossed into Poland. 2 weeks later, Stalin's Red Army invaded from the east. Poland, fighting on two fronts, lasted 35 days. But the dying had only just begun. For nearly 2 years, Stalin believed he'd bought peace with Hitler. He was catastrophically wrong. June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft. The largest invasion in human history crashed into the Soviet Union. In the first 5 months, the Soviets lost 4 million soldiers. Entire armies surrounded and destroyed, cities obliterated. But Stalin gave an order, not one step back. Million were civilians, not soldiers, children, elderly, women, people who never held a weapon. Why? Why did the Soviet Union suffer so catastrophically? First, the war itself. The Eastern Front was where the real war happened. This wasn't bombing raids and naval battles. This was total war, village by village, street by street, house by house. Second, Nazi ideology. Hitler didn't just want to conquer the Soviet Union. He wanted to enslave or exterminate its people, Lebensraum. Living space for Germans. The Slavic peoples were considered subhuman, expendable. 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, not from combat, from deliberate starvation and murder. The Nazis simply let them die in open-air camps, exposed to the elements, given almost no food. And third, Stalin's own brutality. His purges had killed many of the Red Army's best commanders just before the war. His refusal to believe intelligence about the German invasion left his forces unprepared, and his scorched earth tactics destroyed Soviet land to deny it to the Germans. The Soviet people were crushed between two of history's most murderous regimes. The numbers are so large they become abstract. So let's make them real. Imagine a small village in Belarus, 1941. Population, 300 people. Farmers, teachers, blacksmiths, children. One day the Germans arrive. They're hunting for partisans, resistance fighters hiding in the forests. The entire village is rounded up. Men, women, children. They're locked in a barn. The barn is set on fire. This happened in the village of Katyn in 1943. 149 people burned alive. Only one adult and 3 children survived. This wasn't an isolated incident. It happened in hundreds of villages across the occupied territories. Some villages were burned multiple times. The Germans would burn it. The Soviets would rebuild it. Then the Germans would come back and burn it again. By the time the war ended, entire regions of the Soviet Union had been depopulated. In some areas you could walk for miles and see nothing but ruins. No houses, no churches, no people. The land itself bore the scars. Millions of unexploded bombs and shells littered the countryside fields that had once grown wheat were now graveyards. Forests where children once played were mass burial sites, and the people who survived carried wounds that would never fully heal. May 9th, 1945. Victory Day. The red flag flies over the Reichstag in Berlin. The war is over, but victory didn't feel like victory. The Soviet Union emerged victorious but destroyed. 70,000 villages were burned to the ground. 32,000 factories were obliterated. 1,700 towns and cities lay in ruins. In some regions, women outnumbered men 3-1. An entire generation of men was simply gone. This created a demographic crisis that lasted for decades. Millions of women would never marry, never have families, because there simply weren't enough men left. The Soviet economy was shattered. 25 million people were homeless. Industrial production had been cut in half. Farmland was devastated, and yet somehow life had to go on. Women became the builders. They cleared the rubble. They rebuilt the factories. They worked in the fields. The famous images of Soviet women construction workers weren't propaganda. They were necessity. Children grew up in a world where loss was normal. Almost every child had lost a father, an uncle, a brother. Entire classrooms of children were orphans. The state set up thousands of orphanages to care for them. The psychological toll was immeasurable. An entire generation suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though they had no name for it. Then survivors struggled with nightmares, survivor's guilt, depression. But there was no therapy, no counseling. You were expected to simply endure. Many survivors never spoke about what they'd experienced. They buried it deep inside. Some families didn't know their grandparents' stories until decades later, if ever. The war created a culture of stoic suffering in the Soviet Union. You didn't complain. You didn't show weakness. You survived, and you moved forward. Because everyone was suffering. Everyone had lost someone. Today, Victory Day is the most sacred holiday in Russia and many former Soviet states. Every year on May 9th, families carry portraits of ancestors who died in what they call the Great Patriotic War. It's called the Immortal Regiment. Millions of people march through city streets, holding photographs of grandparents and great-grandparents who never came home. Some of the photos are faded and worn. Some show young men in uniform, barely out of their teens. Some show women in nurses' uniforms. Some show civilians, ordinary people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This tradition started in 2012, and it spread like wildfire. Because there's hardly a family in the former Soviet Union that wasn't touched by loss. A Russian man in his 70s once said, "My grandfather, my grandmother's 2 brothers, my mother's uncle, all gone. We never found where they were buried." Of those 27 million, millions have no known graves. They lie in unmarked pits, in forests, in fields that later became parking lots and shopping centers. Even today, construction workers in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine regularly unearth remains. Sometimes it's a single soldier. Sometimes it's dozens, buried together in a mass grave. Volunteer groups spend their weekends searching for the missing, trying to identify them, trying to give them proper burials. The earth of Eastern Europe is soaked with their blood. The cities were rebuilt. Life went on. Children who never knew the war grew up and had children of their own. but the memory stays. Because it has to. Every Russian city has a memorial to the Great Patriotic War, an eternal flame, a statue, a list of names. These aren't just monuments. They're sacred spaces. You'll see elderly people standing there in silence, tears running down their faces. You'll see young couples bringing flowers on their wedding day, because it's a tradition to honor the fallen on the happiest day of your life. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany came at a cost that's almost impossible to comprehend, but it's important to understand. This wasn't just a Soviet tragedy. It was a human tragedy. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews. The Nazis murdered millions of Poles, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others they deemed undesirable. China suffered catastrophic losses during the Japanese occupation. Germany itself lost millions of people, both soldiers and civilians who died in the bombing campaigns and the final battles. Every nation paid a price. Every soldier who fell had a mother waiting. Every civilian who died had dreams they'd never fulfill. But the Soviet Union's losses stand apart, not because Soviet lives mattered more, but because the sheer scale demands that we remember. 27 million people. Let's think about that number differently. If you took 1 second to say each name, it would take you 856 days, working 24 hours a day, to say all 27 million names. That's over 2 years of continuously speaking, without sleep, without pause. If you lined up 27 million people holding hands, they would stretch around the entire Earth at the equator, and then halfway around again. If you stacked 27 million photographs, the pile would be over a mile high. These aren't just numbers. Each one was a universe. Each one had a favorite song, a favorite place, someone they loved, dreams they'd never fulfill, children they'd never have, grandchildren they'd never meet. World War II killed more people than any conflict in human history. It showed us what happens when hatred becomes policy, when human life becomes expendable, when nationalism turns into fascism, when disagreement turns into genocide. The war didn't happen because of one madman. It happened because millions of people went along with it, because ordinary people chose cruelty over compassion, because others chose silence over speaking up, because nations chose appeasement over confrontation until it was too late. There are lessons here if we're willing to learn them. The first lesson: war is not glorious. It's not an adventure. It's not heroic. It's horror. It's children starving in besieged cities. It's mothers watching their sons die. It's mass graves and burning villages and refugees with nowhere to go. The second lesson: hatred, when left unchecked, metastasizes. The Holocaust didn't start with death camps. It started with rhetoric, with scapegoating, with dehumanization, with small acts of cruelty that grew and grew until they became industrialized murder. The third lesson: the cost of war is borne most heavily by ordinary people, not the politicians who declare it, not the generals who plan it, but the farmers and factory workers and teachers and children who just want to live their lives in peace. The generation that fought World War II is almost gone now. The last veterans are in their 90s and hundreds. Soon there will be no one left who remembers the sound of air raid sirens, no one who remembers the smell of a city burning, no one who remembers what it felt like to say goodbye to a son or daughter or spouse, knowing you might never see them again. And when they're gone, we become the keepers of their memory. The responsibility becomes ours. We tell these stories not to keep hatred alive, but to remind ourselves what hatred costs. Not to glorify war, but to remember why we must prevent it. Not to pick sides in old conflicts, but to honor the universal human suffering that war inflicts. The Soviet Union no longer exists. It collapsed in 1991. The country that paid the highest price in World War II is now 15 independent nations. but the memory of what happened there between 1941 and 1945 belongs to all of humanity, because what happened in the Soviet Union could happen anywhere, to anyone, given the right circumstances, the right propaganda, the right demagogue. Any nation can descend into that kind of darkness. 27 million lives. 27 million people who woke up one morning not knowing it would be their last. 27 million people who had hopes and fears and favorite meals and inside jokes with friends. Think about the person you love most in the world. Now imagine them gone. Now multiply that pain by 27 million. That's what the Soviet Union endured, and they weren't the only ones. Add China's 20 million, Poland's 6 million, Germany's 7 million, Japan's 3 million, and on until you reach a total of over 70 million dead worldwide. 70 million reasons why we can never let it happen again. Today, most of the battlefields are peaceful. Grass grows where tanks once rolled. Children play in parks built on top of bunkers. The scars on the land have mostly healed, but if you know where to look, you can still see traces. Fragments of shrapnel in tree trunks, depressions in the ground where trenches once were, buildings with bullet holes still visible in the walls, and the memory remains, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from grandfather to grandson. This is where your great-grandfather died. This is the forest where we hid from the Germans. This is the cellar where we survived the bombing. In the end, remembering isn't about the past, it's about the future. Every time we forget what war really costs, we inch closer to repeating it. Every time we dehumanize our enemies, we take a step down the same path that led to World War II. Every time we turn away from injustice because it doesn't affect us directly, we make the same mistake that allowed the Holocaust to happen. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people because the world waited too long to confront evil, because appeasement seemed easier than confrontation, because people hoped the problem would just go away if they ignored it long enough. It didn't. So we remember. We tell the stories, we visit the memorials. We say the names when we can. We honor the sacrifice, not just of soldiers, but of the millions of civilians who died for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We remember because they deserve to be remembered, because their lives mattered, because their death should mean something, and we remember because the only way to prevent it from happening again is to never forget that it happened in the first place. 27 million lives, 27 million stories cut short, 27 million futures that never happened. Each one mattered, each one was loved, each one left a hole in the world that can never be filled. This is their memorial. This is their story. And as long as we tell it, they are not forgotten. 27 million reasons to never let it happen again. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you deep dives into history's most important moments, told with the respect and emotion they deserve. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next documentary. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And leave a comment below telling us what historical topic you'd like us to cover next.